Hello, welcome to DOC NYC inaugural Spring Showcase, or mid-year celebration of documentary films and series. I'm Ruth Somalo, features programmers at DOC NYC, and it's my pleasure to speak with Hao Wu today, who is the co-director, producer, and editor of 76 Days, brought to us by MTV Documentary Films. Hao, it's so good to see you. As you know, we love your films. We showed them at DOC NYC before, and we've been following your career for a long time. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much, Ruth, for having me. And it's great to be speaking with you today.
So I know the film is done really well, and we can talk about that later. But for those of you who have not heard about the origin story of the film, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about, how did you, when the pandemic first hit us, where were you, and how did you amass this amazing team of co-directors in Wuhan?
Yeah, I think even though it just happened a little bit over a year ago, it feels like a lifetime ago. I think at the beginning of January 2020, I started hearing about this, a new pneumonia like outbreak in Wuhan. But even then, when I was speaking to my filmmaker friends in in China, we're all joking that who's going to be the first one starting making this film. But for me personally, I usually tend to shy away from such newsy topics because as all my film have focus on character-driven stories. And a lot of times I wonder as a storyteller, what more can I can bring to a topic if that's being well covered by news media. But then I think it just so happens, I think COVID-19 touched almost all of us, right? In a very, very personal way. It happened on January 23rd, 2020, the day Wuhan was put under official lockdown. I happened to be flying back to China to spend Chinese New Year with my parents and my sister's family in Shanghai. So even though Shanghai is pretty far away from Wuhan, but as soon as Wuhan was put under official lockdown, the rest of China sort of like went into voluntary shutdown as well. And I just arrived in Shanghai expecting to see the city bustling with festivity because Chinese New Year, China's largest family holiday, and Shanghai being China's largest city with 21 million people. So I was expecting to see a lot of festivities there. But then on the ground, it was like there's nobody. And and nobody was walking on the street, very few cars. It felt really like a zombie film. I was watching the zombie film, and it really like shook me just seeing that. And also spending 10 days just locked inside mostly and scrolling through social media, wondering what was happening, what had made this so bad, and noticing that Wuhan, there was the hospitals were overwhelmed, that the doctors were running out of PPEs. I think most of the country at that time was confused and also at the same time pretty angry. It's like, well, how did the government mismanage this? Why did they suppress the early whistleblowers? So as soon as I came back to New York in early February, when a US network approached me asking me if I wanted to make a film about this, I immediately jumped down because like I had so many questions. I wanted to use the research process as a way to find out what truly happened. Even though later on this US network dropped out, I continued on independently.
And tell us a little bit about how you found your two co-directors, and how did you went about the production side of things? How did you communicate with them? I know they were shooting and sending you footage, and then you started editing. A lot of our audience members are also aspiring filmmakers, so I think the way you went about making this film gives us all hope about making films, collaboratively, internationally, and under the worst possible circumstances. So if you can go into a little detail about that production aspects of things.
Sure. So as soon as I started researching this film, I reached out to my reporter and filmmaker friends in China, asking them to introduce me to anybody who's covering the lockdown on the ground. So just through social media, through some online chat apps, I was introduced to over a dozen filmmakers who had started filming. Some of them were filming inside a hospital. Some of them were outside a hospital. So I asked them to, please share a little bit of rushes, what you're working on, and started discussing if there was any way we could collaborate. But as soon as I saw the footage from my two eventual collaborators, I was truly shaken because by mid-February, I had read so much about what was happening on the ground in Wuhan. And also I've seen a lot of sort of like footage shot on the phone shared on social media. So I had thought I had known enough about what was happening, but to watch my two co-directors footage, because they were so nicely shot with so much intensity and empathy. I feel like I was being transported to the eye of the storm. I was right there experiencing everything. So I made a decision to just like really want to collaborate with them. So the way we did production wise was, they would at the end of each day, they would upload their footage onto a cloud service in China, and they shared the logins with me. So I would download them in New York, but because of the Great Firewall of China, the download speed was pretty slow. So it would take me 2 or 3 days to really review the footage and to see what they have shot. And then we will have get on the phone to talk about, to help them, because one of them, anonymous co-director, it was his first time shooting long form video. So I would, give him some advice in terms of technical production, especially about how to capture sound recording, and sometimes with, just encourage him to do enough cutaways. But we spent most time discussing what the story was about, and which characters to be focusing on. Because like for me, I think for a lot of documentary filmmakers, we like to find those main characters. We want to follow their journey, sort of the hero's journey through some kind of event. Um, but I think it turned out to be almost useless, that kind of discussion, because um, my two co-directors just like started filming. It was so chaotic on the ground. It's really hard to have in-depth discussion with the character to truly understand the personal stories. And also some of the characters will be filming, but then a day or two later, they may be transferred to a different hospital. Their condition might deteriorate, that they could no longer speak or even pass away right in front of the camera. So in the end, I just told them, you know what, just keep on filming as much as you can. There's so much we cannot anticipate. So in some way, the film was truly made during the edit process.
And you were editing even before knowing that you will be able to get permission from them, what, right? And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your editing process, and also, collaborating, with the great Jian Xian, and finding, because something that you do amazingly well in the editing is, first of all, give us the idea that everything is what is happening in this one single hospital, and then also give every character a very special character beat so we can know who they are and like empathize with them. I'm sorry, there's a lot of construction work around here, so I let you work with that.
Yeah, sure. So I think with this film, I think the two biggest challenge in terms of making the film, the first thing was to figure out what the film was about. Because as we were doing production, the pandemic was evolving so fast, right? It traveled to Japan, South Korea, and then in Italy, Spain, and came to the United States. For a long time, we had a lot of discussion about, is this a film about the global pandemic? So, which would require us to collaborate with filmmakers all over the world and try to make the film? Or is this a film about, because I was living in New York, I was filming in New York at that time. Could we make a film about a comparison, compare and contrast two cities' response to the pandemic? Or is it a story about Wuhan? If it's about Wuhan, how long will we continue to film? Should we film the recovery? By approaching end of March, we pretty much knew that the lockdown was going to be lifted pretty soon. Originally, we had expected the lockdown to last until the fall. But then I think in the end, made the decision just to focus on follow the best footage we have access to, and the best footage was still shot by my two collaborators. By the way, they were filming independently of each other. They didn't know each other, just at four different hospitals. And then to make the decision, you know what? Because the Wuhan footage was so precious, let's focus on that. And Wuhan, luckily, the story had a beginning and an end. So we decided, like in April, that's going to be the frame of the story, just to tell that. And secondly, the biggest challenge was really trying to gain the trust, because I never met either of the filmmakers. I was introduced by like some people, some common acquaintance, and to gain, to gain their trust, I started by saying, so whatever you want to do, I want to help you achieve. But if there's any footage left over, maybe we can collaborate using the footage to do a more like some other film as well. But it became really obvious that like neither of them has enough footage to build a strong feature-length film. So I convinced them, say, okay, why don't we combine forces and collaborate together to make a feature-length film? But even then, they were like, I don't know. We had all this discussion. I don't know where you want to take this film. How can we trust you? So in the end, I decided to bite the bullet and just like start editing and trying to come up with a rough cut to show them, because it's easy to talk, but what's more important to have something to show, to say, this is what we discussed and this is how I intend to realize our vision. What can you trust me now? So I started diving into the footage. But then, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, it's really hard. It's a hard film to edit because the characters are all covered with PPEs. You cannot tell them, right? Tell them apart. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they were filming, just trying to capture as much as possible. We didn't know who our main characters were. So when I first started editing, I honestly didn't know how to construct this film, even though I wanted to limit the film to 76 lockdown in Wuhan. So what I did was I edited out 3 scenes that moved me the most. I sent them to Jean Chen, my long-term mentor and collaborator. I said, Jean, do I have a film here? And she watched it. She's like, I cried 3 times. It's so rare to even cry once after watching a complete film. So she said, there's definitely a film here. And then we started, she decided to come on board as my producer. And we started spending a lot of time talking about the creatives. And then I went back and watched a lot of films for inspiration. How do I make a film with no main characters? And then, I just remember a lot of film I used to admire, like Kirsten Johnson's Camera Person, Ramona Diaz's Motherland, and also obviously Frederick Wiseman's film, right? These films are all about institution or a group of people ensemble with no clear main character storylines. Once I saw them, I just feel like so liberated. I'm like, wait, we don't have to do the quote unquote standard documentary, and we can just tell this group of people as they struggle to survive. And then what I did was to really because I was under a time crunch, to really edit out a rough cut to show my collaborators to gain their trust. So what I did was went back to the footage, really go back to the image or a shot or a scene that left me a strong impression when I was reviewing the rushes when they shared with me during production. I went back to those and just trying to edit a scene around that most moving moments, pick them out. They are like strings of pearls, right? And then I try to rearrange the order, trying to link them together. And having a lot of discussion with Jean about creative style and process. And in the end, we just decided, because the scenes are so powerful themselves, maybe in the end, we didn't need to do anything to editorialize it or even to contextualize it. Let's just let people observe what was it like to be in the hospital, in the city under lockdown. So that's why in the end, we made a conscious decision not to include any music or any sit-down interviews or even news clips.
And it works brilliantly. And another big character, I think, of the film is the idea of absence, the absence of human activity in the city. And you make the city a character in what brings us to like the iconography of the sci-fi, zombie apocalyptic kind of films. I felt like I was watching one of those films that we've been accustomed to see in the sci-fi realm, but yet this is real life and this is happening. And the way that you brought us to these like magnificent shots of the city, really empty, that beautiful bridge into the city over the Yangtze River. There's no traffic, just that one ambulance, in the distance. There's these shots that really establish what the world is stopped, and everybody's hiding inside, and this tragedy is happening indoors. We can see it because that's been the biggest tragedy of COVID, that unless it created like two realms, the realms of people that had lost and had themselves been really ill or lost family members, and the realm of people who didn't see anything happening because it didn't affect them. And I think you bring that in such a beautiful way to the film. Maybe you can talk about those two elements, like the architectural landscape of absence, and being honing into the very personal stories, of the parents that are expecting a newborn baby,
Yeah.
the man that is losing his memory, all these contracts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the very beginning of the editing process, because I had asked my collaborator, they were filming inside the hospital. I also asked them to go outside and film more character story outside the hospital, particularly some volunteer stories, as well as some more shots of the city, just different aspects of the city, like the delivery grocery to the residential compound stories. So for a while, um, I was thinking maybe we should make how the film about the city itself, not just the hospital, both inside the hospital, outside the hospital. But then gradually through the editing process, what we realized was even though the stories outside the hospitals were really interesting and revealing, but first of all, I know a lot of other filmmakers are making stories about COVID. They will include stories of how people regular people trying to survive the pandemic. So, what we shot outside the hospital were not that unique, was not that unique. And at the same time, it also kind of slows down the story. It's not, because those story outside hospital was not particularly emotional. So gradually we shrink those stories, we remove those stories outside of the hospital. But still, I feel very strongly is that as we tell how the group of medical professionals as well as patients are trying to survive inside the hospital, I also want to give a glimpse of how the city is to trying to survive. So that's why we leave almost like a chapter markers every time. Once we finish on one chapter, we go out to see, okay, what's happening in the city? Is the city still dead, or is the city gradually coming back? And so that's one artistic, intention. The second one, just in terms of editing, because the story inside a hospital are so intense, so emotionally draining, right? So we definitely want to give a breather to the viewer, so let them come out and breathe, and before they dive back into the character stories again. So for these two different reasons, we decided to have these kind of cityscape shots as interstitials throughout the film.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And a couple of things that also were really striking for me is that you made the decision to start the film at the highest emotional point, where like this heartbreaking story of like a woman that just witnessed, their loved one passed away, and she's probably a medical professional, right?
Yeah, she's
And
a
and
nurse. Yeah.
and that just brings us just right into the problem. There's no contextualization. There's like everything is there. It's like
Yeah.
all the human drama and what's at stake globally, it's in that scene. And that was incredible. And the other thing that really struck me was the idea of the objects left behind, and what they represent for the living, and how much care these professionals are putting into helping the family members grieve by getting their loved one's phone back or medical cards, which is such a ridiculous thing we will not pay attention to, but is and then those phones ringing and
Yeah.
ringing and ringing, and there's 35 messages from a loved one that doesn't know that dad is dead, for example.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was just incredibly beautifully used, and it really brought us to that emotional level, because this shit has been real and is still ongoing in so many places. So perhaps you can tell us about like those decisions, and also a year and some later, what have you learned through this process of like going really deep into examining what's going on with the COVID responses internationally?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first question you asked about the editing decision in terms of putting that most heartbreaking scene at the beginning, there are two reasons. One is that since the film, we made a decision that to have the film really portray the journey of this hospital and the city surviving the lockdown. And that at the beginning of the lockdown was absolute chaos and fear and panic. And so we kind of want the film to not necessarily model or parallel the factual beat by beat evolution of the lockdown or the infection, how many cases were happening in Wuhan. But at least we want the film to accurately portray the emotional journey of that. So that's why at the very beginning we really want to highlight, and it was so sudden. The lockdown happened so suddenly, and people were so underprepared. Not just everyone was underprepared. There were so many heartbreaks before we can see any glimmer of hope later in the film. So that's the primary reason. The second reason is because in terms of character balance, if you look at the film, there are some recurring character like old grandpa with dementia, right? He reappears the most. And then there's Nurse Yang Li returning, cleaning the phone, returning them to the families of the dead. And also there are other character reappears. But there are also some one-off characters, right? There's some one-off character who only appear once. And this scene, I really, really love it. But then the nurse, the things that after her father passed away, it was really difficult for my collaborator to gain access to talk to her, to film her again, because she was in such emotional distress and trauma. So she refused to be filmed. So if I move it later to somewhere else, people would naturally ask, what happened to her, right? So the only logical place is to have her story being in the prologue before the film officially opens, to really hammer in the emotional impact of this lockdown. So for both of these reasons, I decided to put it in the very beginning. The second thing, when you mentioned about the little details about the phones and everything, I don't know. I mean, it wasn't a conscious decision when I was editing it. I think a lot of times when I was editing the film, honestly, I was following my emotional flow. It's like what grabs my attention, because I think just because for the same reason that you feel so moved by watching those images, I was incredibly moved as well when I was watching the rushes. It's like, oh my God, the families couldn't even find each other. Remember, there's one scene where an old grandma just said, "I don't know where my family is. They don't know where I am. I don't read. I don't know their number." So
It's
those
heartbreaking.
moments of panic and separation, and only those little things, the ringing phones and the messages, and these are the only thing left that can at least showcase people are still trying to connect. Or if people passed away, that's the only thing they can leave behind for their loved ones. So whenever I saw those images, my heart would definitely sink and hurt. So that's why I just like maybe subconsciously just want to grab on, hold on my own gaze on those images and put them there. Yeah, I think it's the creative process for me was a lot more like just by instinct, instinctual, rather than consciously thinking this can be a good symbol for anything.
Wow, this is like a masterclass in filmmaking. Thank you so much. This is
Oh no,
no, this thank you for sharing the process. It's such a, I mean, I have so many more questions, and if you allow me one more, like
sure.
there is also, and I think you did a great job at not going necessarily into politics. While there is a lot of politics in the film, you don't make a point of framing it in that way. But there is a moment where we hear something that has to do with the vestiges of what we understand was the Communist Party infrastructure in the neighborhoods. And you have this scene with like the young father of Little Penguin, talking to the neighborhood committee and
Yeah.
asking permission to bring their baby home, and that's like a little window into something that we're not so familiar in the US or maybe in other places in the world. So perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about how these this element of the neighborhood committees was kind of like a very positive thing infrastructure wise, and how they interacted with communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think China implement what we in the West would view as very draconian measures to control freedom movement to put the outbreak under control. A couple of things, right? I'm not a public health expert, so I can only speak to what I understand to be the most effective way. For example, they did massive testing. So anybody who was suspected of having COVID, because that was before any reliable PCR tests was available. So anybody who's suspected of being infected, depends on your medical condition, you'll either be sent into a hospital or you're being sent into a huge quarantine center, converted from stadium. You just have to stay there until you're absolutely clear. They'll release you back home. For everybody else who's not affected, you were confined to your residential compound. You cannot go outside. But honestly, though, during the 76 days of lockdown, these kind of rules change a little bit, right? It's not always super strict. Right? You change it based on the situation. But in its strictest form, nobody was allowed to get outside of the residential compound. Groceries will be delivered to the gate. You saw it in the film. You can pick it up. And then those people who are facilitating, in terms of testing everybody in the residential compound, um, sending the suspected cases to the quarantine sites, as well as delivering grocery and welcoming anybody who's been released by the hospital after sufficient quarantine in the hotel. They were all done by these neighborhood committees. That's neighborhood committees on a grassroots organization organized by the Communist Party. For a long time, some people in China view it as kind of useless anymore. But during this COVID, it proved to be pretty effective as making sure whatever the central government decides the directive gets propagated to the most grassroots level. So yeah, I think that's some people say that's part of the reason that the lockdown was so effective. Because like here, even if New York State or New York City declares a lockdown, who's going to enforce it, right? The police is not going to, there's not enough manpower even for the police. Even if they do decide to implement the rule, they don't have enough manpower to enforce it. But in China, because of neighborhood committees, they were able to.
So I think we're almost out of time, but perhaps you can let us go with your kind of like last comment about, since you made the film and with everything we know, all this time later, what would you like your audience to leave with after watching the film? How, as such an important landmark of what we all went through, because what happened in Wuhan got repeated, everywhere else. And I'm from Spain, and I know how the lockdown in Madrid was not exactly like that, but was very draconian too. So what have we learned, and what did you want us to take on with us from this, from watching this experience in your film?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a year ago, I was still in the midst of making this film, right? And a year later, after what happened in Madrid, in Italy, in New York, recently, the cases exploded in India. To witness what's happening in India, it's absolutely heartbreaking. In many ways, it's actually worse than what happened in Wuhan, even in its early days. So, yeah, I think this whole everything just a reminder that we're not going to overcome this until everybody in the world is safe, is vaccinated, has access to good public health infrastructure. So I think for me, when I was to make this film intentionally apolitical, because for a while I wanted to make this film political, but in the end, I feel for many different reasons. One of the reasons being, I feel like there's enough political discussion about geopolitics in the news media for me to make in a film, especially like my footage doesn't support any discussion on this topic. And also, I just feel like a lot of discussion have focused so much about the numbers, about our political divide, either domestically as well as internationally. I really wanted to remind people about the human cost, the human stories, the human emotions behind these numbers, behind those political discussions. That's what I think. Once again, it was not intentional when I was making the film, but looking back, I feel that was a very strong desire on my part to give voices to the millions and millions of people who perished, right, during this pandemic. sorry, we haven't reached the millions yet, but I think we're approaching there. So yeah, I think right now it's still the same thing. It's like right now the world is gathering together to have this vaccination, fight. How can we help each other more? How can we you know just be able to reach out to each other? I think in some small ways, I guess what I was moved while working on this film was that there's enough evidence of the human capability to be kind to each other, to support each other, to work together for the collective good. I just hope that maybe my film can be part of, you know, COVID documentaries coming out to remind people we're all in this together. And only by working together can we overcome this.
Thank you so very much. This is a wonderful film. It's an emotional and very important experience to watch it. And thank you for bringing it to us and continue this conversation all these months later. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth.